Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondent Club. My name is Florence de Changy. I'm a board member and a foreign correspondent. I'm delighted to be your host today. Right, now to today's topic. Who really cares about the environment, China or the US? We would hope everyone does. And as Simon was telling me, that's not the real question, because obviously it's a global issue. As we all know, the international community was dismayed when the President of America decided to pull out of the Paris Accord. He may change his mind, according to French President Emmanuel Macron. And to discuss this, we have two experts, one coming from America and one from our own Hong Kong. Robert Gottieb is the founder and the former director of the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute at the Occidental College in Los Angeles. And he has written more than a dozen books, and he's been engaged in American social movements for more than 50 years. And then Simon Ng is a fellow and former chief research officer for Civic Exchange, which is a well-known public policy think tank that we often host here. So he's known for his research on air quality. And they told me that when they met during forums, etc., they then decided to work together on today's book. So today, I mean, the book that they've done together. So the book is called Global Cities. There is a website, which is www.globalcitiesbook.com, and it's available for sale at the end of this talk. So without further ado, please welcome Robert Gottieb and Simon Ng.
Thank you, Florence. And thanks to the FCC for having this event. I promise we'll answer the question. And whether it'll be a surprise or not, we can find out afterwards. I'm going to actually cover a bit about the US before the election of Donald Trump, and then subsequent to the election of Donald Trump last November. I don't know if I have a bias exactly, but President Obama, our former president, actually went to, as a student, to the school where I taught for a number of years. So he was then known as Barry Obama, not Barack Obama, but he became Barack in the course of being more focused on public issues while he was at Occidental College. So we did this book. This is actually our first week in doing public events in Hong Kong. We'll be going to China next week. And it was published just a couple of months ago. And it covers a range of urban environmental issues, including issues such as air quality, water quality, transportation, food systems, et cetera. So it is not exhaustive in terms of the range of urban environmental issues, but it captures, I think, how each of these areas really serves as a proxy for some of the broader environmental questions that are faced in Los Angeles, in Hong Kong, and then also how that connects to China. So, does the US care about the environment? And the way to think about that question is to put it in some historical context before November 2016. The environmental questions were not high on the agenda until sometime in the 1960s, where both some key studies were developed, some social movements emerged focused on the environment, And ultimately, a range of legislation was passed from particularly the period of 1970 to 1974, beginning with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And it really created a kind of environmental policy infrastructure in the U.S. It led to the development of the Environmental Protection Agency. And there was a robust social movement dealing with environmental issues that really allowed pressure from below that was distinct from the kind of policy changes that were taking place, and came into play subsequently when you had the Ronald Reagan administration in the 1980s, the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s, where there was some sentiment of at least suspending, if not rolling back, environmental regulations, and there was a fair amount of resistance to it. By the time Barack Obama was elected president, the notion of environment as a priority issue really receded, despite Obama's own statements and the interest of those in Congress who thought environment was still a critical issue. In the 2012 election, for example, climate did not come up in the course of the election between Romney and Obama. But that changed, partly because of the resistance in Congress, and in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, there was kind of a reconnection of the importance and the significance of environment in areas such as air and climate and food, thanks to Michelle Obama, the president's wife, who made the idea of changes around food central to her agenda and subsequently her husband's. But that didn't last. And it didn't last because we had an election of a president and then some critical appointments that were made in the first weeks of the administration, the new administration, that were significantly hostile to environmental issues. Scott Pruitt, who is now the current head of the US EPA, came into office as with an agenda to essentially dismantle both the agency and a wide range of environmental policies with the support of the president, which culminated in the decision to pull out of the, or at least begin a process of pulling out of the Paris Accords. And this included not just the large global set of issues, but very specific ones that had direct impact on not just climate, but sort of daily life issues that people experience in relation to the environment, the air we breathe. There was an ozone standard that was put in place dealing with car emissions, vehicle emissions, and tailpipe emissions from industry that significantly strengthened the question, those issues around ozone. The Trump administration decided it would try and suspend that, and I'll get back to that decision in a second. The mileage standards, fuel efficiency standards, the corporate average fuel efficiency standard that has been in place since the 1970s had been basically flat for a number of years, but again in the last 2 years and even in the last 6 months of the Obama administration, there was an effort to, through an executive order, to significantly change that dynamic and tighten the fuel efficiency standard and to really push for alternatives to gasoline and diesel in cars and trucks. But again, under Scott Pruitt's leadership, there was an effort to undo that standard and a number of others. And it was also in a context where Scott Pruitt, who is sort of a leading climate denier, as Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma, which is heavily oil and gas-based industries that are in Oklahoma, again came into his role at EPA to ensure that climate was eliminated from, whether it was from the research standpoint, from the policy standpoint, such as the Paris Accord, and even from a language standpoint. One of the interesting things that Pruitt did is he released this order that said, you must not use the term climate on the EPA website. And for example, if you think you should talk about climate change in relation to, say, the last 2 hurricanes we experienced, you should say instead it was an extreme weather event, nothing to do with climate. In fact, he made this comment that it was insensitive to talk about those events in relation to climate. He put in place, in terms of the major science role at EPA, the head of the work around science, at EPA, someone who is not a scientist and was also, he was actually a radio host and an economist, sorry to say that, who also had an agenda that climate was not to be part of the system, part of the process at EPA. But there was resistance to that. That began literally from the moment the Trump administration came into power. And there was pushback, and I'm sure you're aware of how California and Los Angeles have been at the leading edge, along with a number of other places around the US, to not only resist around the changes on the environment, but put a more aggressive set of policies and practices that would not only accord with Paris, but move beyond it. And one of the famous episodes that happened right after the Paris Accord decision was made to pull out, the president, through his Twitter resource, stated that I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris. And immediately after, the mayor of Pittsburgh and the mayor of Paris said, we support, not only support the Paris Accord, but we will be doing what we can to make sure that it can be implemented. And it was this kind of resistance and the kind of citizen movements that emerged after the election with the famous chant, "Not our president," that has really created a counterpoint. And I mentioned the ozone rule. That was the first setback of the Trump administration because they were getting such strong feedback that they pulled back from overturning the ozone rule, so it's going to be implemented. So what's the answer for the US? Does the US care? The answer is yes and no. It does care when you think about citizen movements. It does care when you think about the level of resistance amongst certain policymakers, particularly at the local and state level. And ultimately, it does care in terms of wanting to sustain the changes that have been made since the 1970s and move it to that next level. But the answer is no when you come to the president and his head of EPA, the head of the Energy Department, the head of the transportation departments, who are actively hostile to this kind of environmental policy system that has been created since 1970 and doing their best to at least resist any further development, if not pull it back. So I'm going to talk a little about China, and then Simon will talk about Hong Kong, because we don't want to leave Hong Kong out of this discussion. So briefly about China. You sort of almost have the reverse process that has taken place in the US, in the sense that you did have the development of environmental policies in recent years, but it's relatively new, and particularly not in the area of the kinds of issues that we discussed in our book. In 2009, at the Copenhagen meeting, China's role was not hostile to, but not willing to step up to the plate. In issues such as dealing with air quality, dealing with water quality, you had not necessarily resistance to the idea of environment being important and crucial, but it was not high on the agenda. High on the agenda was development, was urbanization, was marketization. This was the strategic direction of the government. That has begun to change, and there are a number of reasons why it's changing. One is that environmental issues, aside from everything else, have powerful economic impacts and do undercut some of the development strategies that have developed. Secondly, although there's not a national organized environmental movement in China, there is a lot of resistance, particularly when it's focused on specific kinds of problems or locations where those problems are felt most directly. And so there is a level of pressure from below that's, I think, is ignored when talking about the environment in China. And then there is a recognition that China, particularly now, since November 2016, can champion itself as a environmental leader, whether it's climate or it's any number of issues, particularly, for example, transportation, shifting towards being the leading manufacturer of electric vehicles as one illustration, and even creating mandates for a certain percentage of the fleet right now has to be electric vehicles. But you haven't seen a full transition. Take the issue of coal. China is committed to now, with its new sort of climate perspective, to start reducing the level of coal used or particularly produced, which has all the environmental impacts that are deeply felt in certain regions of the country. And so in the last 3 years, there's been a very modest reduction in the production of coal for the first time, but not a reduction at that same level in terms of the use of coal, because you have an increase in the imports of coal. So it's a little bit of a complex song and dance that's taking place around environmental questions. But overall, it's clear that China, at the national level, and I would assume at the Congress meetings in October, we'll hear more about that in terms of China's commitment, particularly around climate. But it's not necessarily, when you have robust new policies put in place, that translates into changes on the ground. So one of the core concerns in China is, are these policies being implemented, particularly where you have, whether local governments or industries or sort of the modern agricultural system that sees the benefit of the kind of the status quo in terms of how that's developed. So in conclusion, does China care? And the answer is yes and no. It's not a cop-out, it's reality. China does care It's called the priority of priorities, for example, around air quality by government officials, but the implementation is uneven, and you don't necessarily have that kind of robust social movement that you did have in the last 60 years in the United States that has been created the ability to increase both awareness and the idea that we do care about the environment. So what about Hong Kong?
Thank you, Bob. So what about Hong Kong? We all care about Hong Kong. You've been here for a long time, I guess, and this is your city. We all enjoy life in Hong Kong. But what about our environment, and what about our living condition? Now, I want to bring you back to where we are and say a few words about Hong Kong, because this is close to my heart. We know Hong Kong has experienced a lot of environmental challenges over the years. It's not just about which administration we are talking about and their policy related to the environment. This is about some long-standing problems over many, many years and decades that we're trying to resolve, but without a lot of success. When you think about air pollution problem, it started probably in the 60s and 70s with all the industries, the factories. But then, of course, the sources shifted to power generation, and then we focused on road transportation and then ships. But then still we have the problem. And at one point, I think we even accused Guangdong of producing and exporting all these pollution to Hong Kong. But actually is the externalities of local Hong Kong investors investing in Guangdong factories and then having the pollution coming back to Hong Kong. So I mean, there's been a lot of research and studies trying to find out what happened when it comes to air pollution, as well as other environmental problems. With all the information and with the knowledge, we began to understand and try to look for the more effective solutions to tackle the issues. But then who's going to, come up with all these solutions and policy? It has to be the government. So I think, at the citizens level, I would say in the last 10 years, general awareness about the importance of having good environment, of improving our environmental condition has been growing. If I take the example of air pollution again, I think a lot more people are buying into the ideas that with poor air quality, actually it will affect their health. And that's to the detriment of their well-being. And so they pay much more attention to the AQHI numbers, to all the information that's been put out in the public domain. So they focus a lot and they follow the government and they demand more action from the government. But think about other environmental issues like water pollution. We barely talk about water pollution. We only focus on how much we pay for water in Hong Kong. And when we start to talk about water security issues, not just in Hong Kong, but also in the entire Pearl River Delta region, we just easily go back to how much we pay. And we refuse to focus on the crust of the problem. There are less awareness about biodiversity, even less about noise pollution in Hong Kong. So I think at the citizens level, we are doing okay in some areas, but in general, I think we still need to push the general public to understand why we should care about the environment. Now, I'm encouraged, and I think Bob also, in the last 2 days when we were giving talks in other occasions, we talked a little bit about, how citizens can play a big part, whether it's, having their raised awareness and try to put more pressure on the government, or to even go out and collect data, or to try and understand what's out there in terms of information that could protect us. Now, again, I want to use air pollution as an example. We now have a lot of information about air quality in Hong Kong, real-time data. Some NGO groups even go out and use some small sensors to collect data and then to share on the website. And then that's for what? It's not just to put pressure on the government. Actually, it's to empower the people with more information so that they can take their own action. So I can see that that's a trend that's happening elsewhere, not just in Hong Kong. But in Hong Kong, I think this is going to be something really important to enhance public participation in the environmental issues that we're concerned about. Okay, so that's so much I'm going to say about the community and the citizens. But what about the government? We are barely 2.5 months into the new administration. and a month ahead of the coming policy address. So we have a lot of expectation. But should we have a lot of expectation? Actually, I don't know. I'm torn because on the one hand, I really want Carrie Lam to come up with something, at least something that she's mentioned in her election manifesto. But on the other hand, we know there are other issues that would take priority from the government, say housing, education, so on and so forth. And environmental issues would usually be at the very bottom of the pile. And sometimes, we just have no idea what the government is trying to achieve. But it is really important for the government to take a leadership role. Now, you might find it weird, me trying to put leadership, environment, and Hong Kong government in the same sentence. But actually, it happened before. How come we should always follow what's happening elsewhere in the world? In Hong Kong, we, in the past, actually was a leader. For example, Hong Kong was the first city, always the first cities in Asia, to tighten our vehicle emission standards from Euro 1 to 2 to 3 up to Euro 5. We were the first cities to do that, okay? And when it comes to ship emissions, now this is my topic, so I know a lot about what's been done. Hong Kong is the first city in Asia to regulate ship emissions at the city level. Now, these are the things that's been acknowledged, not just within Hong Kong, but actually outside Hong Kong. And we had, good conversation with mainland China, sharing all this information to the extent that they also put out their own roadmap in terms of controlling ship emissions in their major port areas. So Hong Kong could be a leader. Now, another development is the small sensors. Actually, Hong Kong has played a big part from the universities to develop these new sensors to test and to measure air pollution and air quality. The sensors are becoming lighter and smaller and more sensitive and more accurate. And Hong Kong actually in this particular field is in a leading role. WHO is collaborating with Hong Kong scientists in doing this, and we are also sharing all this information with US EPA. So again, Hong Kong can be a real leader. How come we have to wait until Beijing say, okay, you should do this, and then in the next few days, Hong Kong will say, okay, we'll follow. I think it's just too bad for Hong Kong as a city to take that position. Lastly, facilitator. Now, my previous organization, Civic Exchange, has always played a great role as a facilitator of dialogue and trying to push for policy change. Actually, Hong Kong as a city with the resources and expertise, they can also play a big part as a facilitator to advance discussion in different environmental issues, including climate change. Now, I think the key is environmental problems actually have no boundaries. And as long as we believe this is the case, you need to learn from one another. You need to work together closely with one another. And I think there's always a place for collaborative approach in terms of doing research, in terms of doing engagement, and in terms of devising the best policy to improve the environment in general. And this is what myself and Bob, I think, has preached in our previous work. And this is something that we make it very strongly in our book as one of the key messages. But I really believe that, whether you believe that or not, this is the way to go. So back to the question, whether US or China care more. I don't think it is really important because this is a trend. Whoever is up there as a leader, underneath, there are always actions going on. I think the key would be, are you willing to be part of that action and try to drive change forward? And I believe the answer should be yes. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the two of you for a brief presentation, for a massive question, obviously. So I'll open the floor now. Please introduce yourself before putting your question. Yes, okay, yeah.
Hi, my name is John Antweiler. I am retired. I've chosen to live and work in Hong Kong. My question, which neither of you really talked about in specific detail, was something that bothers me a great deal when I go to the beach, and that's plastic pollution. And I noticed that several nations in Africa have completely banned plastic. And I'm wondering if you could talk about initiatives in Hong Kong or in China or in this part of the world to limit the use of plastic?
Well, thank you very much for your question. And I think this is important. This is an important topic. But as Bob said, we just cannot have everything in the book, let alone this presentation. But I think, plastic. Now, instead of going into the problem and explain or talk about how incompetent we've been doing in terms of cutting plastic use, let me give you some exciting examples. Very recently, I've been told that some of the universities in Hong Kong, including University of Science and Technology, Hong Kong U, and I think also city universities, they are banning bottled water. Now, of course, bottled water and water consumption is one thing, but related to that is the use of plastic for the product. So, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is even without, as I just mentioned at the podium, even without an overarching or clear direction from the government's standpoint, to be brave enough to say, okay, we want to reduce plastic use in the city. Actually, at the bottom level, from different stakeholders group, they are already pushing forward sensible measures that's under their own control to try to reduce the impact of different materials, including plastics, of course, so that they are making a statement as well as actually making real change. So that's one thing. Now, in terms of in China, now that's really not my area, and I have no idea whether they are pushing forward any measures to control the use of plastic. But when you talk about ocean pollution related to plastic, some Hong Kong-based NGOs actually had a lot of wonderful programs over the years to try to promote, the problem related to plastic and how it affects marine life. And they took these ideas and projects into schools, that's as far as I know, to try to, promote the ideas of, protection to the younger generation. So that's what I know, and I understand in terms of what is happening in Hong Kong. Is there anything in the US, Bob?
Yes. The issue of plastics is a significant one in the U.S., and there are actually NGOs that deal explicitly with that issue. And there have been, sort of similar to the bottled water issue, which is also one in the U.S., the checkouts with the use of plastic bags in grocery stores, for example, became an issue. And there's now in several states the banning of plastic bags that's taken place. I think the deeper issue is not just the incremental change, as important as it is, but how you're so much of the production of goods that are like consumer goods have a role where plastic is significant in terms of whether it's packaging, whether it's in terms of the actual product itself. And to make a shift will require not just at the end point, once the plastic bag is created, but to go upstream and to think about where and how that's taking place within the production system itself. Interesting changes in the automotive sector around that, because there's been some pressure, particularly in Europe, of looking at how cars are produced and its different dimensions of where there can be an environmental change that could take place. On the China end, I also wouldn't know how to answer that, except in one of the publications that really has done some of the foremost discussion of environmental issues, China Dialogue. They've raised the question of plastics on several occasions. So that could well be an indicator that it's arising as a significant issue.
Maybe I can also just add that in Hong Kong there are indeed many NGOs very concerned with the plastic in the seas, including one I'm part of, which is called Save Aberdeen Harbour, and they organize Fish for Trash on a regular basis. So if you feel like a fishing party where you collect tons of plastic rubbish, very welcome, and there are quite a few NGOs indeed, but it's incredible that it is at the more at the NGO and the citizen level than at the government from my observation. If I may, I have a question for you, because from what you said, it's all down to an education issue, and from all the information and the knowledge that you've gathered, what would be the most obvious universal messages which would have to be put out there so that human behavior change on such a dramatic scale that we don't achieve the famous, infamous 2 degrees, etc.? Because indeed, it's all over the place. So do you know one simple message? One thing I'm surprised that you haven't mentioned, the meat industry. And recently there is more awareness that the meat industry is causing just as much pollution as the fossil fuel industry, and it's something we don't know. So this kind of thing, eating less meat, is more efficient than taking less often the plane and things like that. I mean, could you...
I think one of the ways in which the environmental activists have shifted gears in recent years. There are groups that call themselves environmental justice groups that talk about, in the United States, that talk about environment is really where we live, where we work, where we play. But beyond thinking about it in terms of the daily life experience, it's also being posed as a health question. And environment is directly associated with people's health. And that really emerged in the last 10, 20 years to become kind of both prominent in the way environment is spoken, but also in terms of the way those who are focused on health see that as a connection to environment. And you look at the proceedings, for example, of the American Public Health Association, you'll see major attention to environmental questions. And if you look at some of the writings in amongst the environmental, both environmental groups and including the agencies, at least pre-Donald Trump agencies, health factor is a significant factor.
Oh, do you want to add something?
Yes, yes. Very quickly, just to add one point. I mean, another way or another, I think it's a successful way, is to attach a number to some of these environmental issues, a number that matters, a number that people cares. When you talk about air pollution, okay, you say API, air pollution index is 65. It doesn't make any sense to any one of us. If you say, oh, it's going to kill 3 people, then people get attention. If you say, oh, it's going to cost Hong Kong 2 billion over the course of 1 year, then more people will pay attention to that. So I think we've done that with the Hadley Index in the past. At the time when we think about how to develop the Hadley Index, we think, okay, we put it aside Hang Seng Index. So we have Hadley Index next to Hang Seng Index. When people look at Hang Seng, they also get a number from the Hadley Index, and then it struck a chord, oh, air pollution is so bad, so I need to do something. So maybe, that's, I think, is also a very powerful way to do it.
Sure. Victor, you have a question?
A quick question for Simon, I think. By the way, on plastic, you know that in Hong Kong you have to pay 50 cents if you want to get a shopping bag at the supermarket. That is one good thing. One of our fellow clubs, the Royal Hong Kong Yacht Club, they won't sell you plastic bottles to take away anymore. So, there are some good things happening, although you also have this problem of individual fruits are wrapped in this kind of puffed up plastic, which is just terrifying. Every time it rains, people put their umbrellas in these stupid plastic bags, of which millions presumably get used each year. But anyway, so there are good and bad. But my question for Simon is really about, the kind of traditional view of environmental issues is that poor people don't have time to think about it because they're too busy trying to survive and make a living. So why is it that Hong Kong, which is one of the world's richest cities, is so backward in this regard? And why does it sort of take a backseat to Beijing, especially when promoting these kind of issues, talking about these issues, is presumably not politically controversial in Beijing. I mean, Beijing isn't going to complain about Hong Kong getting uppity if it does these things. I mean, you said it's just too bad that Hong Kong doesn't take such a position as a city, but my question is, why is it in that position when it's such a wealthy city? Why can't it take the lead on all environmental issues, not just climate change, but everything else about plastic and any number of other issues? It still astonishes me that it's so backward, because other wealthy countries actually have begun to be much more conscious and essentially to force their governments, even when their governments are recalcitrant, to adopt sensible environmental policies.
Well, first of all, I'm not aware that people will feel because it's poor people's problem and they have no time to take care of it and think about it. I think it's more of an expatriate problem that you guys have too much time to think about it. So that's my first comment. But then, secondly, of course, we see a change and a shift in terms of that mentality. Again, using air pollution as a problem. I mean, in the past, it used only to appear on SCMP and the standards. But now local newspapers also report about air pollution. But then they take a different headlines. They want to emphasize how many people will be killed and what would be the bad images associated with poor air pollution. But that's okay as long as we raise the awareness and then we pay attention to how to address the problem. But back to your key question about why Hong Kong is taking a back seat. I don't know. I can't give that answer because I'm not representing the government. Now, I think you asked that based on with the assumption that, the government should take a leading role, or at least they should be more proactive to do it. But is it really the case? Should we just wait until the government to try and do something? I think we have demonstrated, through our experience from LA and also Hong Kong, and even in some of the situations in China, we can take the lead from beneath, from the grassroots, from the community level, from the professional groups, and even from the business sector. Now, we work very closely in the past 10 to 15 years with all the sectors, all the groups that I just mentioned. And they are all very passionate and concerned about environmental issues. And they all are trying to find a way to be part of that solution. So I think instead of waiting, playing the waiting game, see what would happen in a month's time, I would rather focus my attention to work with all these passionate people who care about the environment and try to get something done. Now, as long as we get to a point where, actually there's some, results, good results, then actually the government will pay attention and they will come to the table. And that's the time, I think, the right moment when we bring them on board and try to multiply and scale up all these solutions. That's what we've done with the government in terms of ship emissions. We started with the business, with research institutes, with solid evidence, and then with sensible solutions. Do it on a voluntary basis. And then the government feels that, that's goodwill from the industry. And then we bring them to the table. And then we have the regulation after 3 years. So I think that's the kind of approach we feel that's much more productive in terms of driving and making changes. And I think something similar happened in the US as well. So maybe that's my take to your question.
We have time to squeeze in one more question, if you have one. A quick one, Michelle?
So Simon, a question for you. I used to work with Simon and have recently moved back to Hong Kong less than a week ago. And I was quite astounded that there's no recycling in Hong Kong, and wanting to know what measures are underway and what pressure is being put on the government to do recycling, and then what lessons have been learned in the US on recycling, because that's something that should be straightforward.
Well, I disagree. I think the recycling in Hong Kong, just that it's so confused a system that it's difficult to understand how you do it. Even if you want to recycle, which box should I use? The color schemes. It's just too complicated. I don't know why. When I go to other cities, it's so clear. If you want to recycle a different type of plastic, you know where to go. But then in Hong Kong, either you put it in the same bin, or then you feel, it's going to be trash, going to the landfill anyway. Exactly. and it kind of make people, disincentivize people to do the right thing. So I think it's really bad. Well, yes, as I said, there are recycling facilities, but it's not too extensively being promoted or explained, and you cannot find the bins that you need, probably anywhere near where you live.
But there's no domestic recycling. They introduced it in Britain a few years ago, and everyone said it would never work. My mother said, "Oh, we don't want to do that," and it works fine. I mean, once you tell people this is what they have to do, they do it, and it's incredibly simple. And in a densely populated area like Hong Kong, it really should be the easiest thing in the world. But in the block of flats that I live in, there is no recycling. And the other day, I've been here for a year, back here for a year, I walked onto the sort of public balcony area, which we don't often go to, and there were these 3 little recycling bins, which I've never seen and have never been used by anyone, because no one ever goes up there with any rubbish. They throw the rubbish away outside their flats. I mean, it's extraordinary that there isn't a better system. But maybe Robert can tell us about the US experience.
And actually, with a cautionary note about it, recycling became in vogue about 25 years ago. The extent of recycling was substantial, and it became promoted across the board, from green groups to industry to municipal officials, et cetera. For a variety of reasons. But one of the core messages that came out is, this is the way you are going to help improve the environment. And the cautionary note is that it became, in a number of ways, a substitute for thinking about how one acts in concert with others, as opposed to an individual act with the 50 ways to improve the environment through individual action. And recycling was always at the top of the list, rather than thinking also, or in addition at least, thinking about how in my community, or how in my workplace, or how in my role as a citizen, can we address the kinds of proliferation of waste that occurs, or any of the other range of issues that bring it back to what do you do with after the product is used and it goes into the waste stream. And I think there's begun to be a shift amongst groups that have been engaged around recycling to understand that some of the deeper questions of what in fact happens when products are produced that leads to a system that increases the amount of waste that's in the system.
Thank you very much. I think we could go on for hours about our rubbish habits and how all the ways of recycling it, but I'm afraid it's 2 o'clock, so we have to come to a close. And as a token of appreciation on behalf of FCC, I'd like to hand ties to our 2 hosts, and please join me in thanking them.
Note it's not in a plastic bag for us to take back.
No, but it's not recycled either.